The sudden release of tens of thousands of pages connected to Jeffrey Epstein has created a moment of rare convergence between political theater, institutional transparency, and the deeper question of what the world perceives when it examines the inner workings of American power. At first glance, this may appear to be a purely domestic matter. A convicted sex offender, a disgraced financier, and the sordid details of his connections. Yet when 34,000 pages of documents emerge from the Department of Justice into public view, the implications extend well beyond scandal. They become a study of institutional credibility, a stress test of the American system itself, and a reflection of how global rivals may interpret both strength and weakness in the United States. For decades, Epstein symbolized the hidden intersections of wealth, power, and access. His case became a cipher for the suspicion that elites play by a different set of rules, that the machinery of justice bends when confronted with names carrying political weight or financial influence. The release of these documents, therefore, is not merely an exercise in transparency. It is a forced acknowledgement that secrecy corrodes trust. When Speaker Mike Johnson and Representative James Comer emphasized bipartisan consensus on the need for exposure, they were signaling more than domestic accountability. They were communicating to the global stage that the American legislative system, however imperfect, still retains the capacity to interrogate itself. This is critical, because authoritarian states from Moscow to Beijing continuously seek to portray liberal democracy as hypocritical and hollow. The very act of exposing uncomfortable truths is itself a form of strength, even if what lies within the documents reflects institutional failure. Still, the weight of 34,000 pages cannot be underestimated. The vast majority may contain familiar information, procedural records, and legal motions. Yet the search for names, associations, and omissions becomes the central drama. Republicans will scrutinize for traces of the Clinton family, for potential ties to Democratic figures. Democrats will look for references to Donald Trump or prominent conservatives. The actual victims, whose identities remain redacted for protection, become backgrounded in this contest of narratives. And herein lies the deeper tension. Justice requires privacy for the vulnerable, but politics demands exposure. The Oversight Committee insists it will balance these priorities. Yet both allies and adversaries abroad are watching whether the American system can sustain that balance. To Russia, this may look like internal disarray. To China, it may resemble another opportunity to argue that the United States preaches morality abroad while struggling with corruption within. And to allies in Europe and Asia, it raises the question of whether American democracy remains capable of renewal through painful transparency. The debate over the discharge petition illustrates this conflict. Representative Thomas Massie and others demanded immediate, total release. Yet critics argued that his draft lacked sufficient safeguards for victims and whistleblowers. This is not simply a matter of legislative detail. It reveals a larger philosophical divide. Is the pursuit of absolute transparency always preferable, or must it be tempered by legal rigor and protection of the innocent? From the outside, authoritarian states thrive on weaponizing such dilemmas. Moscow, for instance, manipulates Western openness by amplifying half-truths. Beijing critiques American democracy by highlighting every scandal as systemic rot. Yet neither state would ever tolerate a parallel release of sensitive documents exposing the failings of their own elites. The paradox is stark. By airing its own failures, the United States demonstrates both vulnerability and resilience. It risks short-term embarrassment, but reinforces the long-term claim that democratic institutions are self-correcting. One cannot ignore the historical context. Epstein's earlier prosecution in Florida, negotiated under then U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, is widely regarded as a miscarriage of justice. The leniency extended to him fueled the perception that wealth inoculates against consequence. When Acosta later became Secretary of Labor, the unresolved questions of that case resurfaced. Now, with his testimony anticipated, the inquiry circles back to the original sin of institutional compromise. The larger lesson is clear. When powerful individuals escape accountability, the costs compound over decades. They erode public confidence, distort perceptions of fairness, and invite foreign powers to exploit the disillusionment. The release of these documents, therefore, is not simply a reckoning with Epstein. It is a reckoning with a history of selective justice that has global ramifications. Yet one must ask, what precisely will the global audience take from this? The Kremlin will emphasize that American leaders are mired in scandal, that the U.S. lectures others while failing to police its own. Chinese state media will highlight the bipartisan squabbling, portraying it as chaos and dysfunction. Allies, however, may see something different. They may see a legislative system insisting on bipartisan transparency even when uncomfortable. They may see a democracy willing to embarrass itself in the service of truth. And this, paradoxically, may strengthen the credibility of the United States at a time when authoritarian regimes suppress all accountability. In geopolitics, the perception of strength is rarely about perfection. It is about resilience. The question is whether Americans themselves recognize this, or whether internal polarization corrodes the narrative before it reaches the global stage. Consider the timing. The files emerge just as Congress faces a government funding deadline, a perennial drama that already signals dysfunction to international observers. At the same time, President Trump pushes spending recessions, reshaping the foreign aid landscape. Allies in Europe and Asia scrutinize whether American commitments can be sustained. In this environment, the release of the Epstein documents carries dual weight. Domestically, it is about accountability. Internationally, it becomes part of the larger mosaic of whether the United States can govern itself coherently. To Moscow, any sign of chaos is exploitable. To Beijing, any narrative of elite corruption bolsters its claim that Western democracy is decadent. But to allies searching for reassurance, the exposure of flaws may serve as evidence that America still possesses the courage to confront its own contradictions. The victim's role must not be forgotten in this larger framing. Their testimonies, some dating back to when they were 14 years old, anchor the moral dimension of the case. Without them, the documents are merely paper. Their suffering is the reason accountability matters. Yet geopolitics is rarely about morality alone. Instead, morality becomes a resource in the struggle for legitimacy. If the American system protects victims, punishes wrongdoing, and resists political manipulation, it strengthens its moral claim on the world stage. If it fails, if the documents reveal systemic avoidance of accountability, the narrative shifts. America's adversaries will amplify that shift, arguing that Washington has no standing to lecture others on human rights or corruption. Thus, what appears to be a domestic scandal becomes part of a global contest over narratives of legitimacy. One must also weigh the potential for selective interpretation. 34,000 pages allow for cherry picking. Different factions will highlight passages supporting their preconceived narratives. Republicans will emphasize Democratic associations. Democrats will emphasize Republican links. Conspiracy theorists will exploit ambiguity. Foreign intelligence services will mine the documents for names and connections that can be weaponized in influence campaigns. The truth may lie buried beneath layers of partial interpretation. For the American system, the challenge is to ensure that transparency does not devolve into disinformation. For the international audience, the measure will be whether the United States demonstrates institutional control over its own narrative. Ultimately, the Epstein files represent more than scandal. They are a mirror reflecting the state of American governance in 2025. They test whether bipartisan consensus is still possible. They test whether transparency can coexist with protection of victims. They test whether political institutions can resist the temptation of weaponizing exposure for partisan gain. And they test how the global stage interprets America's handling of its own failures. In Moscow, strategists will ask how to exploit the perception of hypocrisy. In Beijing, officials will calculate whether this moment aids their campaign to present authoritarianism as more stable. In European capitals, leaders will watch closely, to gauge whether American democracy remains resilient enough to lead. And in Washington, the question will remain whether exposing the past strengthens or weakens the present. The release of 34,000 pages is not the conclusion of the Epstein saga. It is merely a new chapter. The deeper story is about the credibility of institutions, the integrity of justice, and the geopolitical consequences of transparency. Whether this strengthens American democracy or erodes it will depend less on the content of the documents than on how the nation responds to them. For adversaries, this is an opportunity to weaken the American narrative. For allies, it is a test of whether the United States can embody the principles it advocates abroad. And for the American people, it is a moment to decide whether painful truth can still serve as the foundation of collective renewal. In that sense, the Epstein files